to the international economy.
The latest in today from Libya, where the West has now been enforcing a no-fly zone, which has meant 5 consecutive days of bombing different parts of Libya. And today, France has shot down a Libyan plane. Now, of course, the no-fly zone was decided at the United Nations, where a decision was taken that to protect the citizens of Libya who are protesting against Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, that they should be protected because Libya's armed forces were using every means at their disposal to crush the uprising. Nonetheless, more than 60 people have already died in the Western airstrikes to enforce that no-fly zone. Well, that makes us wonder exactly whom that no-fly zone is supposed to be protecting. But of course, the no-fly zone was set up by the UN after the Arab League agreed and in fact demanded that it should be enforced. Elsewhere, protests have now also started in Syria, where more than 15 people are now reported dead in protests, as the Syrian government is in no mood to see happen in the Syrian capital or elsewhere what perhaps happened in Cairo, where weeks and days of protests eventually resulted in the Egyptian president Hosni Mubarak having to step down. And of course, these are not the only countries. This whole story started in Tunisia, and protests have since spread to Bahrain, where of course Pakistanis have been drawn into the bulk of the fighting, and reports also of protests in Saudi Arabia. So it seems like most of the Arab world, or at least major centers of the Arab world, are now being drawn into this continued wave of protests that are sweeping the Arab world. But is the West reluctant to deal with the change? And if they are reacting, is it in the correct manner? What is Pakistan's position in all this? What should our position be? These are the questions we are going to be exploring. Allow me to introduce my guest in the studio. My first guest in the studio is Mr. Abdur Rahman Matar. He is the correspondent of Al Jazeera Television based here in Islamabad. My second guest today is Dr.Moeed Pirzada. He's the director of World Affairs at Pakistan Television. And joining me from Karachi, it's going to be Mr. Shahid Amin. He's a former ambassador. He is a foreign policy analyst and author, and has served as Pakistan's ambassador to Libya as well. So we hope to draw on his expertise on the diplomacy front. But I'll begin here, right here in Islamabad, with Mr. Matar. Mr. Matar, the no-fly zone, we saw it as a means to protect the Libyan people from what Colonel Gaddafi's forces were doing. But now it seems to have possibly gone a little bit out of hand.
Exactly, and now the claim by the West and the NATO forces is that those fighters of Colonel Gaddafi has merged themselves in the cities among the population, so it's difficult to differentiate between Gaddafi loyal soldiers and opponents. But this is the claim. But exactly what is happening now, imposing a no-fly zone should be a difficult task even for the NATO forces.
Sure.
Because it is Libya is a large country, and it is a deserted area, but still there is so many military bases in Libya. And to control these military bases and to impose the no-fly zone, definitely they need a lot of effort, they need a lot of...
But you see, Mr. Matar, how do you see the Western effort, the NATO or the Western effort for the no-fly zone? Is it to protect the Libyan civilians from Colonel Gaddafi's air bombardment, or is it to enforce a regime change in Libya?
Definitely it is both, and I think the second is the real aim of the Western forces, and especially the NATO forces. While the first claim is the cover which they had from the United Nations Security Council resolution, that okay, you have to protect the civilians in the Libyan civilians. But definitely the end of protecting civilian population is to enforce the no-fly zone, and then there will be other steps will be taken by the NATO forces, no doubt. At the end, the regime of Colonel Gaddafi must go, at least for the NATO forces.
Seems like that's the way it's going to be. Dr. Pirzada, of course, what we have seen is that the West has enforced no-fly zones in the past. We've seen that over southern Iraq. We've seen that over Kosovo. To a large extent, there was marginal no-fly zones over Croatia and Serbia, but those were quite a while ago. The West has a lot of experience in enforcing these kind of no-fly zones. Should there have been so many civilian casualties in 5 days?
It's a difficult question to ask me, actually, in the sense that
I have no real understanding of how the Libyan population is placed and why there's such high
Okay, so let me
casualties.
flip that then. Let me flip that around and say that, do you think then that this is a regime change?
Definitely. There's no
There's
second
no doubt
opinion. The President of the United States is on record saying this, that we want Colonel Gaddafi to leave. We need a regime change. And the French and the British plan seems to, if not a regime change in the whole of Libya, they're looking for creating a concession area in the east of Libya, which has most of the oil. And don't forget that there is some sort of commercial battle going on between the Italian interests.
That's right.
In the last 2 years, since 2008, with Silvio Berlusconi signing a number of contracts, Italians are looking for major gains in Libyan oil. And also, whereas Libya is not one of the major oil producers in the world, it only produces 2% of the global oil, but it has a special importance to the European oil needs in the sense that Libya is very closely placed with the European markets.
Exactly, the proximity, the geographical
so I think
proximity.
that whereas the Americans have blundered into this conflict, somehow or the other, the Americans have blundered into this conflict, which is not going to give them much. But French and British have very definite goals in terms of getting the commercial interest. And even if Libya is split, they're not necessarily looking in terms of controlling the whole Libya. If, as a result of this conflict and the civil war, this is not actually protecting the civilian lives. This is not, in fact, protecting a mass movement like Egypt or Tunisia.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there's a major difference there.
This is a domestic, internal, civil conflict, civil war in a tribal society in which French and the British have decided to intervene, and the Americans have followed them along.
Let's go on to Karachi, where we're joined by Ambassador Shahid Amin. Ambassador Amin, of course, you've heard what our analysts here in the Islamabad studio have to say. The real question, of course, is that Colonel Gaddafi has always been the bogeyman for the West for decades. After Lockerbie, of course, it had become much, much worse when sanctions were imposed on Libya. Now, that had started to change in the past few years. Do you think that Colonel Gaddafi has seriously miscalculated what was happening in his country, perhaps following to the same trap that Saddam Hussein fell into and not reading the writing on the wall that Hosni Mubarak saw?
Yes, firstly, let me make the point clear that Gaddafi has had a very unbalanced record throughout, but for the last 6 or 7 years, he has had very good terms with the West. The West has no problem at all. The West has no problem at all getting oil from Libya, because as I already mentioned, Libya is very close to Europe and has very good quality oil. So Europe is a natural market for Libya, and so there is no new attempt to seize Libyan oil, because Libyan oil was already available to Europe. And so far as Italy is concerned, it is fully cooperating in the current military expedition, so there is no problem between Italy and France and Germany or Britain. The real issue is that...
But Italy was very resistant to join initially.
Yes,
yes, the real issue is...
the real key here... Yeah, please carry on.
Yeah, the real issue is that there is a democratic wave spreading all over the Arab world. It is very infectious. And remember, Tunisia and Egypt are the neighbors of Libya. So we see a pattern that in a number of Arab countries there is a popular rising, and it is generally welcomed by the world because it is democracy against dictatorship. But in Libya, unlike Egypt, Colonel Gaddafi decided to use force to crush the opponents, and this force was so brutal. He was using aircraft, tanks and everything against these protesters, and there was a moral issue. The moral issue was, one, we can let Gaddafi go ahead and kill all opponents brutally as he was doing. The other was that the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution without a single negative vote from anybody on the request of the Arab League that the no-fly zone should be imposed, basically to prevent Gaddafi Air Force from attacking the protesters, and that these civilians in Libya should be protected as far as possible. This is the whole background. There is no conspiracy in my view to seize Libyan oil. The issue is a simple one. There is a tyrannical government which is trying to kill its protesters by the use of brutal force, air force and tanks and everything, and the world feels a duty. And remember, the Security Council is reflecting the view of the world.
Okay. Thank you, Master Tamim. Master Tamim coming in with a different. He says
but
there's no
definitely let me add a
conspiracy.
few points. First of all, the legitimacy of this, the whole thing of the, agreed, the Libyan, the Colonel Gaddafi had blundered into hugely, and there was a huge public opinion
And he
against
seems very
him.
disconnected from reality. I mean, did you see
Totally,
that press conference that he had?
he's lunatic.
Yeah.
He's lunatic. He has to. But the Arab League, the legitimacy of this Arab League. I mean, this is the same Arab League. If it were passing some other kind of resolution or asking for something, the whole Western world would say the Arab League represents dictatorial regimes. It's not really representative of the Arab and the street public opinion. But right now, this Arab League has become so sacrosanct. There's also an African Union, right, AU,
Yes.
which decided against the military action, and no one is really talking of the African Union.
Right.
Now, also, the Italy resisted. I mean, Ambassador is forgetting Italy resisted. It was not possible for the Italy to resist in the end.
You see, but here's the problem, Dr. Pirzada. One of the issues that, of course, comes to mind over here is that while the Arab League definitely supported the no-fly zone prior to the UN meeting, after the airstrikes began, Arab League
one
objected.
last pebble
Sure.
into the whole thing.
Oh,
Look at what's happening in Bahrain, where there is a Western-supported government, and the GCC troops moved there, and the Saudis moved in there.
yes.
After Robert Gates visited, the Secretary of Defense, and he nodded into the action while he was double-speak, while he was talking of human rights, he was talking of pro-democracy movements, the Americans nodded the GCC countries to send their troops into Bahrain, and a lot of people have been killed in Bahrain, and no one, neither the New York Times, nor the Washington Post, nor the British publications, no one is really talking seriously of what's happening
Neither
in
are
Bahrain.
we. Neither are
Neither
we.
are we. I mean, we have a despicable record anyway.
Which is what really bothers me, of course, is because we know the Fifth Fleet is right there. And that has a lot to do with Bahrain's position. But let's just talk a little bit about Syria now. Because Syria, again, you know, one of the problems is that things are moving so fast. And then with the tsunami in Japan, the international media has also really been handling major international stories simultaneously. But here's the issue. Syria has now come now. If Syria is going to look at what has gone earlier, they're going to look at Bashar al-Assad, will look at Hosni Mubarak, and he's going to look at Colonel Gaddafi. Which model do you think he's going to follow?
Situation in Syria is a little bit different. Let me first of all tell you that yes, this is the Arab world in which there is 22 countries, but still each one of them has its own flavor, has its own specialty. In Syria, a little bit situation is a little bit different because the ruling elite in Syria belongs to the minority of the Nusayri sect of Muslims. So there is a large Sunni population. There is some Shia also population among them, but this is the minority which is leading on ruling the.
So you said
country.
Nusayri. I have not heard of this. Could you tell me a little bit more about it?
It is a Nusayri group, Alawi they call it sometimes.
Okay.
It is one sect of the Muslims who are in Syria mainly, and approximately they are something like 2.5% of the Syrian population. This group of Syrian people are ruling the country.
So they're also the Baath party, the Syria Baath party.
The people who belong to the party, the Baath party, is also from other religion sects as well. But what I'm trying to say is that there is some sort of speciality in Syria regarding the uprising over there, which is not only against the regime and against and demanding rights and something like that, similar to Egypt or Libya, but they are also against ruling by this small minority of the population. So this gives a little bit different flavor, different situation to what's happening in Syria. Latest number is are talking about something like 200 killed.
200, okay, because that I had 25.
Yeah, this is the latest figure which has been published by so many news agencies, and they are saying that still it is continuous. Now, situation in Syria, there is another speciality in the case of Syria. Syria is home for many of the Palestinian resistance groups.
Absolutely.
And they are the main supporters of Hezbollah in Lebanon as well. There was some kind of tension in Jerusalem and in Gaza 2-3 days ago, especially there was a blast in Jerusalem yesterday. A lot of people now think that these are created type of tension in Palestine, Israel, in Jerusalem and Gaza, in a move or a try by the ruling regime in Syria to divert the attention to what's happening in the region, Lebanon,
Right.
Jerusalem, and Gaza, and definitely it is in their favor now to make themselves as they used to